You think you know everything about Cuba and the USA. Today, we'll be joining Sophia and Henry, who will discuss some aspects that you may not have known. So stay tuned until the end.
Okay, so get ready to dive deep today because we are tackling US-Cuba relations, and the material is fascinating, really. Declassified stuff from the Clinton White House, deep dives into the Bay of Pigs, even court documents about, get this, academics in Cuba. We're talking about, well, moments of hope, moments of utter disaster, and this constant back and forth. Should America engage with Cuba or isolate them?
Yeah, it's a wild ride through history, that's for sure. And it's really interesting to me how all these different sources, some official, some, well, not so much, come together to paint this really, really complex picture of a relationship that, let's face it, has never been easy.
Absolutely not. And speaking of unexpected sources, you would never think Cuban cigars would be our entry point into, like, serious foreign policy discussions, would you?
Well, I guess they say any press is good press, even for cigars, right?
Right. And we're not even talking about just any cigar smoker here. This is Wayne Smith we're talking about. He pops up all over these documents, a real key figure in this whole U.S.-Cuba story. And in one memo from back in the Carter years, it's document 2 in the personage.pdf file, he just casually throws in this line about how few, say, U.S. cigar makers would object to the importation of fine Cuban cigars.
It's a small detail, sure, but I think it speaks volumes. You see, Smith, he really got it. He understood that sometimes, to build bridges, you got to find common ground. It could be anything, even a shared love of a good cigar, you know? It's this human touch that's often missing in the very serious, often cold world of international diplomacy.
Yeah, I see that. Okay, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's set the stage a bit. We're talking about Cuba right after the revolution.
Yeah.
1961, Eisenhower cuts ties. The Bay of Pigs invasion, well, it's a disaster. Not really the best start to a beautiful friendship, right?
Not exactly a fairy tale beginning, is it? And that historical context is so, so important because you've got this legacy of broken trust, suspicion even, and that's incredibly hard to just shake off. So fast forward to the 90s, Clinton's in the White House, and we've got these declassified memos, 1.pdf, and FEZ 64516612B2C49, C49B8534, B43BF 6812.pdf, and you can just feel them grappling with this legacy, trying to find a new path.
Yeah, and those memos talk about information overload, right? Calibrated responses, promoting democracy. It's like a crash course in diplomacy jargon. Oh, and then there's this whole thing about the Cuban Democracy Act. What was that all about?
Huge deal, the Cuban Democracy Act. Essentially, it was this attempt to do two things at once, which is always tricky. So on one hand, you've got the U.S. embargo on Cuba, still very much in effect. But then on the other hand, they wanted to encourage more contact between ordinary Americans and Cubans. The idea was that by increasing these everyday interactions, you know, people to people, you could sort of plant the seeds for democratic change kind of from the inside out.
Really interesting strategy, but did it work? I mean, was this balancing act actually effective?
Ah, the million-dollar question. And you know what? Even within the Clinton administration, there was no easy answer, no consensus. Some officials, they were all about engagement, believed in it strongly. Others, they were skeptical, argued that it would only end up strengthening the Cuban government without any real change, any real reforms.
Fascinating stuff. Now, there's also this memo about reforming the Cuban Broadcasting Board. What was that all about? Was that like America's attempt to create its own Cuban radio station or something?
You could say that. Yeah, the Cuban Broadcasting Board was in charge of radio and TV Marti, which were basically U.S.-funded stations beaming content straight into Cuba, and the goal, you know, to provide an alternative to the Cuban state-run media, which, let's be honest, was heavily controlled. Of course, this caused a huge uproar. The Cuban government, they saw it as blatant propaganda, you know, meddling.
So we've got this, well, this tangled web of history, right? And then things get really intense in the 90s. We're talking Clinton administration now, yeah. The memos mentioned something called a migration crisis in 94. What was going on then?
So in 1994, you had this mass exodus of Cubans trying to get to the U.S. It was a perfect storm, really, a combination of a really tough economic situation in Cuba and, well, political crackdowns. Chaos, basically. And the Clinton administration, they were caught trying to manage this huge, sudden wave of migrants.
In these memos, we can actually see how they try to handle it all.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at FAS 645-166-12B2C49, C49B8534, B43BF6019.pdf, it talks about the sheer number of humanitarian visa applications. It was overwhelming. It really hits you, you know, the human cost of this political standoff. People were literally risking their lives to escape.
But you realize these policy debates debates, they have real-world consequences, for real people.
No doubt about it. And it comes up again and again in these files. Like, there's this one 1995 speech draft, same file, where Clinton's talking about using calibrated responses. The idea was to encourage reform in Cuba, but cautiously. One example that comes up is opening up agricultural markets, basically letting U.S. farmers sell food to Cuba. Again, it's that tightrope walk, right? Trying to find that sweet spot between engagement and isolation.
It all circles back to Wayne Smith, doesn't it? Remember his comment about the Cuban cigars? It's like he was saying, look, let's start with something we can all agree on and go from there. But did this calibrated approach work? Did it gain any traction?
Well, it definitely had its obstacles. Remember the Cuban Democracy Act, that two-pronged approach? It caused a lot of friction, especially within Cuban American communities. They were very opposed to anything that even hinted at softening the stance on the Cuban government. Their argument was that engaging would only prop up the regime, wouldn't lead to real change, just more of the same.
And we see that reflected in the documents, too.
Absolutely. There's this memo, 61139S in personage.pdf, that really underlines this tension. It talks about how much pressure the Clinton administration was getting from these Cuban American groups. It really complicated their efforts to, try a more open relationship with Cuba.
Wow. It's amazing how much domestic politics, internal pressures, can shape a country's entire foreign policy. But even with this push and pull, it seems like there were moments of, I don't know, maybe progress.
There were glimmers, for sure. The memos mentioned some limited cooperation on things like, trying to stop drug trafficking and even some military-to-military contact. It seemed like there was a chance, even if it was slim, that both countries could find some common ground.
And then, bam, 1996. The Cuban Air Force shooting down those civilian aircraft. What a blow. It feels like the complete opposite of those glimmers of hope we were just talking about.
It was a tragedy, no other way to put it, and it really set back U.S.-Cuba relations. It just underscored how deep that mistrust ran, Despite those attempts at cooperation, it was still there.
Really drives home the point that for all the policy talk, the diplomatic maneuvering, we're talking about human lives here.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another pivotal moment, one with repercussions even today. The Bay of Pigs invasion.
Oh, man, the Bay of Pigs. Let's unpack that. We've got these conference documents you mentioned, bayofpig.pdf. Sounds pretty academic, but this wasn't just a bunch of professors chatting about history, was it?
Not at all. This is a gathering of former adversaries, U.S. officials, Cuban officials, historians, even some people who were directly involved in the Bay of Pigs, all gathered to share their perspectives and try to figure out, well, what went wrong?
Wow. And this conference actually led to declassifying some of their own files on the Bay of Pigs.
It did. They released a treasure trove of secret information, including Castro's direct orders to his troops during the fighting. This was a huge shift because it offered a whole new way to understand the invasion, challenged the, let's be honest, the very American-centric narrative that existed before.
It's amazing how getting a different perspective, even on an event that happened decades ago, can really change your understanding of things, But as much as things have come to light, there's still a lot we don't know about the Bay of Pigs, right?
Yeah.
That bayofpig.pdf file mentioned a classified CIA history of the invasion.
That's right. Even after all these years, the CIA is still fighting to keep its full account of the Bay of Pigs under wraps. They've released some documents, but there are still crucial pieces of the puzzle missing. It makes you wonder what they're still so worried about.
I know. What are they hiding? Okay, so we've got these official secrets, but then we also have those oral history transcripts, trans1.pdf. Those are pretty fascinating because they give us these first-hand accounts from the people who were actually involved in planning and executing the invasion. One detail that jumped out at me was Richard Bissell. He was one of the main architects of the Bay of Pigs, defending the use of those outdated World War II-era aircraft. It seems like such a bizarre choice. Why not use the most up-to-date equipment?
Well, you have to remember the political climate at the time. The U.S. was trying to maintain plausible deniability. They didn't want to be directly linked to the invasion if it went south, which of course it did.
So the thinking was that if they used old planes, they could always say, hey, those weren't ours.
Exactly. It was a way to try to keep their involvement covert. Of course, it was a risky gamble, and as we know, it backfired spectacularly.
It's a good reminder that even the most carefully laid plans can go horribly wrong, especially when you're dealing with something as complex as international relations. And it's also a reminder that these events are not just historical footnotes. They have a lasting impact on people's lives, both in Cuba and in the United States.
Absolutely. And that's what makes someone like Wayne Smith so interesting. He dedicated his career to trying to build bridges between the U.S. and Cuba. even when the two governments were at odds.
And that commitment really comes through in these documents. We see him advocating for engagement throughout his career, both within the government and after he left. He really believed in the power of dialogue and people-to-people contact.
He did. And for him, it wasn't just about governments talking to each other. It was about creating opportunities for everyday citizens to connect students, artists, academics. He saw those connections as crucial for fostering understanding and breaking down the walls of mistrust that had been built up over decades.
And that ties in with his work on academic freedom in Cuba,
Right.
right? The personache.pdf file mentions his involvement in ECDK, that group that challenges travel restrictions to Cuba.
Exactly. Smith saw restrictions on travel and academic exchange as counterproductive. He believed that the more Americans interacted with Cubans on a personal level, the more they would see each other as human beings, not just ideological adversaries.
It's a powerful idea.
Hmm.
And it makes you think, what if we'd been able to build more of those bridges earlier on? Could it have changed the trajectory of U.S.-Cuba relations?
It's impossible to say for sure, of course. But what we do know is that the more we understand about the history of this relationship, the missed opportunities, the political calculations, the human cost, the better equipped we are to navigate the future.
You're right. And that brings us to today. We've seen a thawing of relations under Obama, only to have things freeze over again more recently. It's a reminder that the U.S.-Cuba relationship is still a work in progress, with no easy answers.
Exactly. But as we've seen throughout this deep dive, it's a history full of surprises, so who knows what the future holds.
Well, on that note, we want to leave you with this. Think about everything we've discussed today. The push and pull between engagement and isolation, the weight of history, the role of domestic politics. If you were advising the current administration on Cuba policy, what would your top priority be? And what lessons from the past would you want them to keep in mind? It's a question worth pondering as we continue to grapple with this complex and ever-evolving relationship.
I want to thank Sophia and Henry for this interesting conversation and you for staying until the end. If you have any comments, don't forget to write it and subscribe. Until the next meeting.